I still remember the exact moment something inside me shifted, the first unmistakable crack in what I believed was a perfect marriage. It was a Tuesday night, and the apartment was drenched in the dull orange glow of the kitchen light. She was in the living room, sitting cross-legged with her phone in hand, pretending to read a book. But I noticed it immediately. The twitch of her lips when the phone buzzed, the slight jerk of her shoulder, the way her eyes darted to the screen before returning to the page. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it. After all, I loved her. I trusted her. I had built my life around her laugh, the softness of her hand in mine, the way she used to hum when she cooked. But that night, something inside me whispered that the trust one clung to was fragile. I didn't know it yet, but it was about to shatter. Days later, I found it, her secret. I had gone to grab my charger from the nightstand and noticed a phone lying face down. On a whim, almost instinctively, I unlocked it. Nothing seemed off at first. Family photos, playlist suggestions, calendar reminders. And then the little red icon, bright and insistent. Tinder. My stomach dropped as if it had been punched. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to think. I told myself I should put the phone down, walk away, pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity, that dreadful curiosity, dragged me forward. I tapped the app, and the world shifted under my feet. Her secret life unfolded before me like a twisted novel I never wanted to read. There were dozens of conversations, flirtations, late-night messages, suggestive emojis, even plans I wasn't part of. The realization hit me like a freight train. She had been living a double life right under my nose. And worse, I had been blind to it. I sank to the floor, phone resting on my knees, scrolling through messages that detailed her betrayal. The text became more than words. They were evidence of a love I thought was shared but had been manipulated. And then there was a photo, her, smiling at a restaurant, a man's arm slung casually over her shoulder. The caption was mundane, but my heart knew the truth. I had been replaced, even if just emotionally. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every shadow in the apartment seemed to whisper accusations. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like her footsteps leading to someone else. I began noticing the little things I had ignored before. Her sudden late night, the new perfume that wasn't haze, the way she laughed at messages I wasn't meant to read. Every rationalization I had offered myself crumbled like brittle glass. I tried confronting her, gently at first. "You've been working late a lot lately," I said one evening, trying to sound casual, hoping I was overreacting. She looked up, smiled too brightly, and said, "Yeah, just extra project at work." But I heard the lie in her tone, felt it in the tense set of her shoulders. I wanted to ask more, to demand honesty, but fear froze me. I wasn't ready for the chaos her truth would bring. Weeks went by in a blur of grief and simmering anger. I replayed every interaction in my mind, dissecting smiles, words, and gestures. The apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage, every corner a reminder of a betrayal. And yet, despite the growing storm inside me, I still wanted to believe the best in her. I loved her too much to let go without understanding why. The days after I found the Tinder app felt unreal, like I was living inside a warped reflection of my life. Every ordinary moment carried the weight of suspicion. Every smile she gave me now seemed like performance. I began to notice things I had always overlooked, tiny inconsistencies, subtle shifts in her tone, little changes in her habits that suddenly screamed betrayal. It was as if the apartment itself was conspiring to remind me of the life I thought I knew. I started keeping a mental log. Wednesday night. She claimed to be catching up with an old colleague at a coffee shop downtown, yet when I peeked at her location via shared map, it showed her 2 blocks away at a quiet bar I had never been to. Thursday. She said she was working late on a project, but I caught the faint scent of someone else's cologne lingering on her jacket. I hated myself for noticing it, for letting these little clues erode my sanity, but I couldn't stop. Each clue was a splinter, each lie a nail in the coffin of my trust. The first confrontation was subtle, almost cowardly. I remember sitting across from her at our kitchen table, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and the faint scent of her perfume, too strong, too deliberate. "You've been spending a lot of time at the office lately," I said, my voice trying for casualness but cracking under the weight of suspicion. She smiled, too perfect, and replied, "Just a big deadline, nothing to worry about." Her eyes, though, flickered for just a fraction of a second, a hesitation, a shield she hadn't fully raised. My chest tightened. I wanted to demand more, to pull every lie from her lips, but I didn't. Instead, I swallowed, forced a small nod, and retreated to my thoughts. At night, I lay awake, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. I could hear her breathing beside me, even feel the warmth of her body as if we were still connected in the simplest, most human way. But I knew we weren't. The betrayal had introduced a distance that couldn't be bridged by proximity alone. My mind raced through every memory, trying to find the exact moment things had gone wrong. I asked myself over and over, had I missed the signs? Was it me? Or had this been inevitable? The questions had no answers, only echoes of heartbreak. I started noticing patterns in her behavior I had never seen before. There was a way she would disappear for hours on weekends, claiming errands or visits to friends I didn't know existed. There was a phone she carried everywhere, even to the bathroom, an extension of her secrets. And then there were the late-night messages, flashes of laughter, emojis, words that made my stomach churn with jealousy and rage. I told myself I should look away, that ignorance would at least preserve the remnants of our life together. But the compulsion was unbearable. I needed to see the full extent of her deceit. One Friday evening, I found her laughing at her phone in the living room while I sat in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through my emails. The sound was unbearable. It wasn't the laugh itself, but the intimacy it suggested, the knowledge that it was meant for someone else. My hands tightened around my coffee mug, knuckles white. The room suddenly felt too small, too confining, as if the walls were closing in to witness my humiliation. I wanted to confront her, scream, break something, but I froze, paralyzed by the fear of what I might discover. I began to withdraw, both from her and from the world outside. Friends noticed my quiet, distracted demeanor, the way I flinched at her name on my phone, the way I hesitated when talking about our perfect marriage. I felt like an actor trapped in a play where I already knew the ending, yet I couldn't leave the stage. Every moment I spent with her was a calculated risk. Would she slip and reveal the truth, or would I finally be forced to confront the full magnitude of her lies? The tension between us grew, subtle yet unbearable. There were evenings when she would kiss me goodnight, and I would feel the lie in her lips, the half-truths she fed me with every caress. I caught myself studying her hands, the curve of her fingers, the way she brushed her hair, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with a woman who had been hiding a world from me. It was impossible. Each day she smiled. I saw a stranger in the reflection of our shared life. Then came the night that changed everything, the night I realized that ignoring the truth was no longer an option. I had returned home early from work, my mind already teetering between rage and despair, and found her at the bar she had claimed to just walk past. She was seated across from a man, laughing, leaning in close in a way that made my chest constrict. The world seemed to slow. Every laugh, every gesture was amplified. I remember the metallic taste of panic in my mouth, the way my hands trembled as I gripped the car door, unable to move, yet unable to leave. I watched her through the glass, seeing everything I had feared. The bar was dimly lit, smoky, filled with a low hum of conversations and clinking glasses. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, catching the light just enough to seem like a halo I had once thought I belonged under. And then I saw it, her hand brushing his, the subtle touch that sent an electric jolt through me. I felt nausea, anger, heartbreak, all at once. The betrayal wasn't a rumor, a hunch, or a fleeting suspicion. It was real, tangible, undeniable. When she finally noticed me outside, her expression froze for just a fraction of a second, a look I had seen in the mirror of my own despair. The mask slipped, even if only for a moment, and I knew she was caught. I didn't say a word. I drove home, the car's engine a dull roar in my ears, my mind racing with plans, fantasies, and the growing, simmering need for revenge. The woman I had loved was no longer mine, and yet I was not ready to let her walk away unscathed. By the time I reached the apartment, the adrenaline had faded, leaving me hollow, trembling, exhausted. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of streetlights casting shadows that felt like accusations. The questions had multiplied. How long had this been going on? Who was he? Was it just physical, or had she fallen for him emotionally? And perhaps most frightening of all, how much did I still love her, despite everything? That night, I realized that I had a choice. I could crumble, let the betrayal destroy me, or I could fight back, not physically, but in the only way I knew how. I would reclaim my dignity, my agency, and perhaps, in the process, expose her duplicity in a way she would never forget. The slow burn of my plan began then, in the dark, in the hollow ache of my chest, fueled by heartbreak and the growing, intoxicating fire of revenge. I told myself I wouldn't become a caricature of a betrayed husband, no smash plates, no drunk nights crawling through the past. I'd stay careful, methodical. The cold part of me, the part that cataloged receipts, timetables, the way the light hit the tiles, took over. If she wanted a secret life, fine. I would learn its architecture, map its exits, and then decide whether to burn the building down or walk out with everything I could carry. The first real step was small and almost ridiculous. I started pretending not to care. At dinner she would ask about my day, and I'd answer with the blandness of someone who'd been practicing neutrality. Went to a client meeting. Long day. Her eyes searched mine for a reaction I refused to give. She pushed a forkful of salad through mashed potatoes and smiled, as if we were actors hitting our marks. The absence of reaction unnerved her more than any confrontation ever could. I could see it in the micro-expressions, anxiety behind practice calm, and impatience I fed into a plan. I watched her pattern from the safe, domestic angles I'd once loved. The bathroom mirror where she'd tamed stray hairs, the hallway outside our bedroom where she'd pause with her keys. I learned the contours of her lies. There were always small windows of time, an hour between her meeting and her supposed train home, the late Wednesday shift that never showed up on any company schedule. I started keeping a log, dates, times, locations, writing them with the mechanical focus of someone building a case. There was a clinical satisfaction to it, a way to turn grief into data. Late one night, I downloaded an app that lets you create temporary email addresses. I told myself it was research. I made a fake profile, plausible, not vulgar, just a digital shadow I could use to reach into the places she'd been hiding. My hands trembled the first time I wrote the profile bio, witty, casual, a little world-weary. I chose photos that weren't lies. My own sister sent me images from a photography hobby. I tested it first in my head, rehearsed what I'd say if she ever asked why. Curiosity, I thought. Information. Something in me loosened the night I sent the first message. I didn't write to her directly. I messaged a username she had been in contact with, an alias that showed up in those early Tinder threads. The account responded quickly, emoji-heavy, thick with familiarity. It was like tapping a vein. They wrote casually, the kind of light intimacy that builds without consent. Brunch plans, inside jokes, a photo of a sunset. When I asked where she was, the responses were careful at first, then blunt, out with friends. You'd like her. The digital world had cruelty of its own, so clinical, so indiscriminate in its betrayals. The more I learned, the harder it was to feel anything uncomplicated. Rage was easy, grief was harder to stomach. I found myself rehearsing the conversations I might have with her, imagining myself as both prosecutor and defense attorney in a courtroom where our marriage was a defendant. Was it emotional? I'd whisper into my pillow. Was that love for him? Did she kiss him? I pictured her hand in his, the warmth that had once been mine shared with another. Sometimes I would rage in the shower, hot water washing salt from my cheeks, imagining how clean it would feel to erase the stain she'd left. But method demanded patience. I couldn't expose her on impulse. Retribution without proof would make me the lunatic. So I collected. I saved screenshots, printed messages to PDFs, kept a small folder on a flash drive labeled with a kind of dull, bureaucratic name that would hide its content from anyone who glanced at it. There was a perverse intimacy in assembling it, like composing an elegy. Each file was a small death, a joke, a plan, a photograph. I labeled them meticulously. Later, that order would be my armor. There were nights I imagined turning it all public, emailing friends, sending screenshots of family, posting them where everyone we knew could see. The fantasy tasted sweet and bitter at once. But I was still in love in the parts that weren't broken. I wanted her to feel the shame but not to be destroyed. That contradiction gnawed at me. I wanted revenge and mercy in the same breath. It made me crueler because I knew what mercy would cost me, the slow, uncertain arc toward forgiveness, and I wasn't certain I had the courage for it. The domestic sphere became a theater for small wars. I started rearranging things, the places she kept her favorite mug, the stack of books on her bedside table, as if a disorder would dislodge something in her. Once, after she went out, I left the front door unlocked and sat on the couch until dawn, watching the light shift across the room. When she returned, she asked with a touch of real surprise, "Why are you up?" I answered, "Couldn't sleep." It was a lie layered over other lies. Her expression changed. Relief or guilt, I couldn't tell, and later that day she hugged me in the kitchen with an intensity that smelled faintly of another man's cologne. The contradictions made me dizzy. I also started testing her in small, calculated ways. A photo of the two of us would appear on my phone screen during breakfast, a fake notification from a mutual friend. Nothing direct, only enough to prompt a slip. If she glanced at it too long, I'd watch how she reacted. Sometimes she'd laugh, then quickly change the subject. Other times she'd grow quiet, fingers suddenly still on the knife as if the world had shifted beneath her. Each reaction was a readout I stored away. Despite it all, the domestic routine continued. Laundry, bills, the awful constancy of grocery lists. Her voice still had the same timbre when she asked me about the trash, the same cadence when she read a text aloud. Those ordinary habits were cruel reminders of how intertwined we were, how easy it was to fall into the old grooves. I resented that comfort almost as much as I resented her. It made my cunning feel like a betrayal of our former selves, a necessary treachery performed in service of something that felt justifiable, the truth. And truth, I told myself, required one final, decisive act. I didn't know what that act would be yet. Maybe I'd confront her with the evidence and demand honesty. Maybe I'd expose her to everyone. Or maybe I'd stage something that would force her to choose. The long game was still unfolding. There were gambits to be tried, risks to weigh. The more I measured my options, the more apparent the hazard. The deeper I dug, the less certain I was of the shape of my own heart when the dust cleared. In the quiet hours, late at night when the apartment hummed with refrigeration and street life, I would turn over to the dock and whisper the question that had taken over everything. Who had I become? The person who catalogued every lie, who set traps in the name of justice. Was he the same man who once built a life out of small kindnesses? I didn't like the answer, but I liked the resolve that sharpened every morning when I woke and tasted revenge like a cold coin on my tongue. I was patient. I was careful. I was ready to see this through. I began to understand how small betrayals create new anatomies of attention. Where once my mind wandered toward recipes and weekend plans, it now mapped exits and entrances, which door she used, how long it took to lock the car, the cadence of her voice when she lied. My life narrowed into a set of observables. The world became a grid of small truths I could test, an empirical theater where every gesture might reveal a fissure. That morning started like any other. Rain against the windows, the apartment smelling faintly of wet concrete, and the lingering sweetness of her perfume on the scarf she'd left on the armchair. When she kissed me at the door, I felt the old electricity, immediate and complicated, desire tangled with the knowledge of other lips. I let her go, watched her disappear down the stairwell, and counted the seconds until her footsteps faded. The counting was a ritual now, a way to quiet the panic that threatened to upend me. I used my work travel as cover for certain incursions into her life, conference calls that were actually stakeouts, late nights that put me on the periphery of the places she frequented. I justified each deception as proportional to the deceit I had found. But lying to catch a lie is a crooked logic. I felt the edges of it fray with every small fabrication. Still, the information I gathered felt pure. Locations, faces, routines. I learned that she favored a late evening tapas place on weekends, that she left her coat draped in the same corner of the bar, the way she laughed when someone told her a private joke. One afternoon I followed her to a florist. The rain made her hair cling to her temples. She wore a coat I recognized only by the faint threadbare spot on the collar. She moved with a casual grace, as if she had nothing to hide. Watching her choose a bouquet, papery peonies, waxy greens, felt obscene. I wanted to step in, to take the stem from her hands, and demand to know for whom they were meant. Instead, I hovered across the street, a ghost with a camera phone, recording the mundane choreography of her deception. When she left with the flowers wrapped in brown paper, she was alone. For a terrible, electric second I thought perhaps I'd been wrong, that perhaps a Tinder life was ephemeral, a flirtation that hadn't crossed certain lines. I allowed myself the dangerous luxury of hope. That hope was brief. At the crosswalk she met him, a broad-shouldered man with a lazy grin, the kind of grin that suggested familiarity and a lifetime of private jokes. Their hand brushes were so casual I could have missed them if I hadn't been looking. He took the bouquet from her, gentle, practiced, and kissed the side of her head as if he owned that small territory. The world narrowed again into the cold, metallic taste of betrayal. I watched them through my windshield until they disappeared into a storefront, two silhouettes that should not have fit in the life I had built. The image lodged in my skull, her head tipped back, laughing, the light catching on the peel of a smile I had once made my own. I drove away with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, the rain streaming down the glass like tears someone else had cried. For the first time, seeing them together didn't just hurt. It inflamed a new clarity. It wasn't simply that she had cheated. It was that she chose to open a door and bring someone into our home-constructed world, and that choice had the intentionality of cruelty. After that day, my surveillance sharpened. I learned his name, Mark, through a mutual friend's offhand comment, the way gossip always leaks through small social channels. Mark was an architect, apparently, with a dry humor and a confidence that wore like a coat. He had separate weekends and a presence that took up space. The thought of him occupying the room where we used to listen to vinyl records made me nauseous. I began to catalog him as I had cataloged her texts, Instagram likes, late-night check-ins, a pattern in his head tilt when he smiled for photos. I wanted to understand him the way I had wanted to understand her. Knowledge felt like leverage. I had to be strategic. If I acted too quickly, I risked being the bitter spectacle I had sworn not to become. If I waited too long, evidence might vanish, messages deleted, meetings rephrased, traces wiped clean. The slow justice I craved required patience and precision. So I refined my tools, an encrypted email account, a burner phone for calls and messages, a discreet friend willing to corroborate sightings. I rehearsed plausible explanations for my own behavior, work stress, health checks, anything that would prevent suspicion from turning toward me. Still, the intimacy of daily life sabotaged my plans in small, quiet ways. She would lay out coffee cups at the same angle each morning, humming a tune I could not name. The way sunlight pooled across the rug where she sat reading in the afternoons became a private theater. I would plant myself at the window and watch the play of light on her profile, the small expressions that made her recognizable. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It mutates. Sometimes, as I watched her, a memory would arrive, us laying on the same rug, unpacking moving boxes, swearing that the other person was the safest harbor. Those memories were knives I held against both of us. The cracks in us were not only about him. They were fissures in my own moral architecture. I was becoming someone who watched, someone who weaponized silence. I caught myself rationalizing the unthinkable, that exposing her publicly would teach a lesson, that destroying the image he'd cultivated would restore some balance. Sometimes I imagined subtle cruelties, an anonymous email sent to her office with screenshots, a late-night visit from someone who knew too much, little eruptions that would force honesty or his retreat. At other times I imagined something quieter, me leaving, taking our life with me, letting the absent speak. One evening, after a day spent assembling proofs and mapping dates, we sat across from each other at dinner. The apartment hummed with the refrigerator's low drone, and a distant siren that feathered the windows. There was a movie on the television, dialogue a soft murmur, but our silence was a real soundtrack. She reached for my hand. It felt tentative, as if she too could sense the tectonic plates shifting under us. I did not pull away. Instead, I let her fingers close around mine and watched the expression cross her face. Relief, perhaps, or guilt, perhaps both. For a moment we were actors in an old play, playing the part of a couple who had grown through shared calendars and synchronized seasons. I could have used that moment to be generous. I could have asked her to explain, to unspool the reasons beneath the reasons. But generosity requires a strength I no longer felt I possessed. I had been collecting for months, and collection is a teacher of habits. It trains you to keep score. So I kept my silence, tasting the iron tang of a decision being made. The long game had revealed a path. I could dismantle the things she loved in public and private, or I could step away and take what remained of myself. Either choice would be violent in its own way. Outside, a truck rolled by, the sound cutting through the apartment like a metronome. I imagined the next move with a clarity that bordered on cruelty, the late-night email composed with clinical detachment, the text sent at dawn, the photograph that would make a truth undeniable. I felt the faint moral vertigo of a man who knows the map of his own degradation. Revenge felt like a restoration and a surrender at once, a paradox that had become the center of my waking life. Somewhere between the revenge I imagined and the man I had been, there was a hinge. The hinge moved the moment I tucked the burner phone back into the drawer, the way you close a door on a room you no longer occupy. I had built the tools for devastation. Now I had to decide not just whether to use them, but what I wanted to become after the dust settled. The answer was not yet clear, only that the next move would not be made in haste. It would be precise. It would hurt. And, whatever else, it would be mine. There's a moment in every plan where fantasy hardens into logistics, when the delicious cruelty of imagined outcomes must confront the mundane realities of timing, witnesses, and proof. I had rehearsed scenarios in 1,000 permutations. Quiet departure dawned with our life packed into boxes, a whispered confrontation that ended with apologies and tears, a public unmasking that would rip the fabric of a new life into readable shreds. Each fantasy felt clean in the mind. In practice, revenge demanded paperwork, timestamps, corroboration, a narrative that would survive other people's scrutiny. I told myself I wanted truth more than spectacle, but truth, I'd learned, is easily translated into spectacle when the heart wants it to be. The difference mattered only to those with an ethical compass. Mine kept spinning, and I learned to steady it with small, actionable steps. First, secure incontrovertible evidence. Second, control who saw what and when. Third, decide on a scale that achieved restitution without tipping into cruelty that would hollow me. It was a moral knife edge, and I balanced on it by counting off nights and names. I spent nights cross-referencing receipts and messages. A dinner receipt with Mark's name scribbled on the top. He'd left it at the table in haste. I had a photo of the bill she'd once claimed was from a client meeting. I found a thread where she'd suggested a weekend away and then messaged him about options that very afternoon. I traced credit card charges to a hotel 2 neighborhoods over and matched the dates to absence from our apartment. Each match was a small, exultant victory, a pin pricked into the map of her public lies. I printed sheets of paper, stapled them into a packet, and labeled it in the bland font of bureaucracy, evidence, personal. There was an ugly thrill to seeing the packet take shape. I remembered how I'd once assembled travel itineraries for both of us, how innocent and hopeful those pages had felt. Now the pages were weapons. I wrapped the packet in a plain folder and slid it into the glove compartment of my car, feeling its weight like a promise. I rehearsed the words I would use when I finally spoke, measured, calm, a prosecutor's cadence. The fantasy required that I be composed. Rage would only make me messy and risk losing the upper hand. Step 2 demanded allies. I needed friends who would not recoil at the blunt truth, people who could corroborate sightings, forward messages, confirm the pattern. I reached out to 2, Anna, who had known us since college and was a quiet, practical woman whose moral clarity I trusted, and Tom, who worked in communications and could help me craft a message that would land with precision. I did not tell them everything. The architecture of betrayal requires controlled exposure. To Anna I confessed the basics, dates, the app, the photograph. She did not ask for drama. She simply said, "Bring it." Tom volunteered his help without judgment, offering to check the legalities of dissemination, privacy laws, defamation risks, practical things that smell faintly of adult restraint. Even with allies, the plan was dangerous. There were legal and emotional pitfalls. Exposing someone's private messages could open me to accusations. Public shaming could rebound. Friends might choose loyalty to her over loyalty to me. I accepted that risk as part of the currency I was spending for the return I wanted. I grounded myself with a mantra I repeated in the shower, in the car, when sleep floated away. I am not the villain in my own story. The line held only insofar as I allowed it to be convenient. The first real move was subtle. I created a private blog, locked, unreadable to the public without a password, where I uploaded the compiled evidence with dates, screenshots, location pins, and careful annotations. It read like a dossier. I wrote with a clinical tone on purpose, substituting rage for precision. The blog's URL I gave only to Anna and Tom. If you need to see proof before you believe me, I said when I texted them, it's there. The mere act of uploading felt like setting a trap with a mirror in the middle. When she saw it, she would see herself as I had arranged for others to see her. I considered blackmail the dark, instantaneous fix that could coerce a confession or a retreat, but the thought repulsed me as much as it tempted me. Blackmail would make me complicit in the same moral degradation I loathed in her. I wanted her to be accountable, not to be forced by fear. So I ruled it out, even as the hunger for immediate recompense gnawed at me. Timing mattered. I watched her calendar, the rhythms of a wake, and the small rituals she performed before leaving the house. Pocket checks, the double glance in the mirror, a final text. I knew Mark's pattern enough to predict the cadence of their weekends. I chose a rain-heavy Thursday for the reveal, a small cruelty that felt symbolic. Water to wash the filth away, or to make everything slippery and exposed. Tom found a public forum, an email list for mutual friends and colleagues, where a single announcement could ripple through our social circle without being indiscriminate. The thought of an email, cool and factual, announcing a truth I'd been hiding excited and frightened me in equal measure. But even as the plan sharpened, a human hesitation crept in. I found myself replaying scenes, her hands making coffee, our mismatched mugs warming in the morning, Mark's laugh that had once sounded foreign in the walls I'd built with her. The tenderness that remained in private moments made me hesitate. Could I destroy someone I once loved in the name of justice and still survive the aftermath? The question had no clean answer. My love was not a currency I could spend without consequence. The week before the reveal, I began a different strategy, calibration via small exposures. I sent an anonymous text to one of Mark's friends, nothing incriminating, only a question about plans this weekend meant to confirm that he'd be in town. I sent a screenshot of a message thread to Anna to test whether she would react with shock or skepticism. Each tiny probe was like touching a hot burner to see if the flame was real. The probe confirmed what I already knew. The network that supported them was porous and fragile, not a wall but a web. On the night before the reveal, I sat on the floor of our living room. The dossier spread around me like fallen leaves. The apartment hummed with negligible sounds. The refrigerator's quiet oscillation, the distant laughter of a neighbor, the rain tapping a staccato rhythm against the window. I felt like a composer before the first note, anxious, anticipatory, committed to the score I'd written. There was no joy in it anymore, only a cold, resolute patience. When she came home that night, she moved as she always did, shoes off by the door, keys on the hook, a soft, exhausted sigh that had once been the soundtrack of our most ordinary moments. She kissed my forehead and said, "Long day." I said nothing. The silence was heavy and deliberate, the prelude to what would be a new arrangement of our lives. I watched her, cataloging her expression, the way she paused when she noticed a small stack of papers on the coffee table labeled, "For you." She smiled, an automatic, untroubled curve that made me ache with the old, contradictory tenderness. I rose to my feet and crossed the room. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. "I need to talk." Her smile faltered slightly when I said it, just enough to give me the thrill of confirmation. The apartment, usually a place of comfort, felt charged, electric and suffocating all at once. The rain outside had tapered to a drizzle, but the sound against the windows was relentless, drumming in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I motioned for her to sit on the couch. She complied, slow and cautious, like a cat sensing danger it cannot outrun. I placed the folder in front of her. The label, "For you," was almost ironic in its simplicity, a subtle reminder that she had been careless enough for me to assemble this. She leaned forward, picking up the top sheet, scanning the first screenshot. Her eyes widened, just slightly, before narrowing in calculation. I watched her reactions like a student observing chemical reactions in a lab, pausing guilt, surprise, and the faint trace of indignation. I can explain," she said, her voice measured, careful. The old rhythm of our conversations, the same cadence I had loved, was still there, but it carried a hollow weight. "I don't know what you think this is, but..." I cut her off gently but firmly. Don't start with excuses. Don't start with lies. My voice was calm, but the underlying current of anger hummed beneath each word. I let the silence settle after that. Silence is a power words often lack. It forces the guilty to occupy their own conscience while the observer maintains the moral upper hand. Her hand hovered over the papers, trembling slightly. I noticed the perfume I had once loved, faint now and metallic with fear. She was no longer the untouchable woman I had trusted blindly. She was human, fallible, exposed. And I was fully aware that my own moral latitude had expanded in ways I had once imagined impossible. We were two predators circling the edges of our shared history. I know about Mark, I said finally, letting the words hang. Her breathing hitched, a subtle panic that I had been waiting to see. She tried to interject, but I held up a hand. I've documented everything. Messages, photos, dates, receipts. I know who he is, where he was with you, what you told him, and what you lied to me about. I saw her shrink back slightly, the casual arrogance she wore outside stripped away in the intensity of my gaze. For a moment, she was quiet, just breathing, and I could hear the pulse in her throat. You've been tracking me, she asked finally, voice tight, a mixture of disbelief and fear. Yes, and I will continue tracking if I must, I said. But this isn't about watching anymore. It's about you understanding the consequences of your actions, and you will understand. My words were measured but laden with a chill that had been months in the making. I wasn't speaking to hurt her arbitrarily. I was speaking to make her confront the world she had spun in lies. Tears gathered in her eyes, and for a brief second, I saw the old vulnerability I had once adored. But that vulnerability no longer sparked compassion in me. It ignited resolve. The emotional intimacy we had shared had been exploited, and it was not my burden to soothe her now. The betrayal demanded reckoning, and I was its architect. I never wanted you to find out this way, she whispered. It was true that I had orchestrated nothing directly harmful to her physically. Everything I had done had been calculated, precise, slow burning. But the emotional impact was undeniable. The world she thought she controlled, her careful compartmentalized Anne, her casual duplicity, was now in my hands, meticulously documented and ready to reveal. You lied to me. Every day you came home. You lied, I said. My voice was calm, but it carried an intensity that made her flinch. And every night I went to bed with someone I trusted, believing our life meant something. You were elsewhere, choosing him. Her head dropped slightly. I let the pause stretch, savoring the weight of truth settling in the room. Finally, she looked up, her lips trembling, words failing her for once. I noticed the subtle tremor of her hands, the way her body leaned inward as if shrinking from a storm. The storm wasn't outside anymore. It was in me. I was no longer the passive husband, the one who had internalized suspicion and grief. I was the executor of consequences, the slow-moving reckoning she had ignored until it became unavoidable. I didn't think you'd see, she murmured, voice breaking. You didn't think I'd notice, or you didn't think I'd care. I asked softly, almost conversational, though every syllable carried months of fury, heartbreak, and betrayal. She said nothing. The silence confirmed everything. I moved to the next layer of the plan, escalation. You will make this right, I said, my voice tight with control. You will own this, not just with me, but publicly if necessary. Friends, family, colleagues, they will know what you've been doing unless you are forthcoming. And believe me, I have the evidence. Her face paled at the word publicly. I could see her calculating options in real time. We spent the next hour in a careful negotiation of sorts. I demanded explanations, not just for what she had done, but why. She offered fragments, emotional neglect, curiosity, loneliness, but her words felt like splinters. They explained nothing and only confirmed the moral gap between us. I listened without interjection, cataloging the rationale, watching the defenses crumble. Finally, I set terms. She would cooperate fully if she wanted to mitigate public exposure. She would end contact with Mark. She would agree to attend couples therapy, if only as a performative acknowledgement of guilt. And she would accept that the dossier existed, that I had the capacity to make all of it public in an instant. By the time the rain stopped outside and the last droplets clattered faintly against the window, she sat slumped, drained, a shell of the confident woman who had once cheated without pause. I didn't gloat. Gloating was for children or cruel men, not for the architect of slow justice. But the satisfaction was quiet, precise, and deep. Control returned to me, the balance of our lives momentarily righted. That night, I slept with a dossier hidden under my pillow. My dreams were restless. Fragments of past laughter, images of Mark's grin, the memory of her fingers brushing mine, now tainted. But for the first time in months, I felt a measure of clarity. Betrayal had revealed itself in full, and I had survived the revelation. And in the quiet ache of my chest, I recognized the truth. Revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes it's about proving to yourself that you can endure, that you can reclaim agency, and that even after the most intimate violation, a person can stand unbroken. After the confrontation, the apartment took on the tentative hush of people tiptoeing over fractured glass. She moved with a careful choreography, as if being watched by more than the single pair of eyes that now watched her. Sometimes she would catch me looking, an involuntary tilt of my head while I pretended to read, and her face would collapse into an expression I could not name. Shame, calculation, panic braided into one. I had given her the option to come clean. How she used that option would shape everything that followed. She tried to scrub the traces first. It was a clumsy thing to watch, too obvious, too horrid. Her phone went into airplane mode more often. Messages that had been steady evaporated into thin silence. She started clearing browser histories with the speed of someone learning to erase evidence, her fingers moving like a pianist practicing a new, urgent piece. I watched her from the doorway as she swiped and tapped, the blue light of the screen painting her face in harsh, accusatory hues. She imagined herself discreet. Discretion was a skill she had never mastered. Her attempt to control the narrative were palpable everywhere. Frantic text replies that were clipped and apologetic, a sudden interest in charity events that mapped onto our mutual friend list, a perfunctory public show of closeness when we walked into gatherings together. She even asked to post a selfie of us, smiling, close, to signal that everything was fine. I agreed to the photo and watched her posture as if I were reading confession in the lines of her shoulders. The smile was practiced. It didn't reach her eyes. I saved the image anyway, a private archive of her performances. But erasing digits and clearing histories doesn't remove people from the world who remember. Mark's friends, the bar staff, the florist, mundane witnesses, remained unwashed. I had already whispered to a couple of them in neutral tones. Do you remember the night when? Their faces had flashed momentary confusion, then the slow settling of recognition. People are terrible archivists for secrets, even when they want to preserve them. Detail leaks in stray comments, in laughter. I began to use those leaks, gentle prods into their memory, recording their recollections in small, voice memo files stored under innocuous names. She noticed the net tightening. One evening after she returned from yet another meeting, a word that had become hollow, she found me seated at the kitchen table with my laptop open, an innocuous cup of tea cooling beside it. The soft hum of the refrigerator accompanied the quiet clack of keys. She asked, carefully casual, "Everything okay?" My voice was even, just catching up on some work. I watched her face for signs of relief. There was none. Her lips thinned, and for the first time she met my gaze with something like fear. That fear was a tool I didn't relish using, but it was effective. She began to argue small points in our house, as if trying to reclaim narrative control. "You never called me when I was gone," she said one night, voice small and edged. "You left when I needed you." Her words were designed to rearrange culpability onto my shoulders. Classic misdirection. I could feel the old ache, wanting to take responsibility so the more tender parts of our history could be salvaged. But responsibility had limits. Betrayal did not vanish because one person chose to shoulder grief. So I matched her misdirection with my own form of restraint, public composure and private accumulation. While she performed remorse in the daytime, I built a quieter dossier at night. I intercepted receipts through third parties, retrieved deleted images via cache backups on shared accounts, and had a friend who owed me a favor hover near Mark's circle at a gallery opening to record who he talked to and where he lingered. Each piece added density to my case, a gravity that made her evasion feel less effective by the day. There were times I watched her sleep and felt the old tenderness like a fossil, beautiful in its own way but ultimately dead. In those moments my hands would curl into fists beneath the covers, not from rage alone but from the ache of lost intimacy. I remembered the first time she'd fallen asleep on my chest, breath soft, her hair a warm fan across my ribs. That memory warmed and then burned me. It was an ember of what had been, and I could not smother it without losing a part of myself. The conflict inside me was relentless. Could I dismantle the life we had built without harming the remnants of love that still lived in my bones? Her attempts at reconciliation were performative at first. Flowers left on the kitchen counter, notes with trembling handwriting, a list of things she promised to do, therapy, transparency, no contact. I appreciated the grammar of apology, but dismissed the punctuation when it felt tactical. "I'll show you," she said one morning, eyes bright with rehearsed vulnerability. "I will do everything." I wanted to measure sincerity not by phrases, but by the absence of rehearsed gestures. So I waited. My patience was not mercy, it was a test. There was a curious thing about vengeance. The more I planned it, the less monstrous it felt. It became, perversely, a responsibility I owed myself to restore a sense of order. But every step toward exposure required proof that could not reinvent itself. To release the dossier without legal or social blowback, I needed corroboration beyond our private disputes. I reached out to someone who worked in HR at her company, not to shame her work circle, but to see if there were patterns, unexplained absences, sudden schedule changes, expense reports, that could anchor my claims in documented reality. That contact was careful and clinical. They asked for specifics, and I gave them dates. The corporate world, I discovered, keeps files in ways lovers do not, an unromantic archive of time stamped by software and process. One night, she came home late, rain making the hallway smell of wet wool and street smoke. She entered with a softness that suggested apology, eyes glassy with unshed tears. She began to speak about loneliness, about mistakes, but I cut her off gently. "Talk is easy," I said. "Actions are the ledger I read now." The word ledger felt apt, precise, immutable. She stood there, a smaller person than the one who had left for flirtations and dinners, and the sight of her diminished did something complicated to me. It didn't make me forgive. It made me see the arithmetic of heartbreak. For every small kindness, there had been a debt of betrayal. Her efforts to scrub the footprint slowed as the evidence around her hardened. She could erase messages and delete accounts, but she could not unspool the habits that betrayed her, patterns of movement, witnesses, paper trails. Each small attempt to contrive normalcy reverberated against the backdrop of the greater narrative. She had chosen to build a secret life. Accepting that truth was both a liberation and a curse. It freed me from excuses I had once given her, but it also forced me to accept the finality of our rupture. On a rainy afternoon, I overheard her on the phone. Quiet tones, a voice that trembled between pleading and resolve. She spoke to someone I couldn't hear, and the cadence of her sentences carried a new weight. It was the voice of someone negotiating the consequences she had finally acknowledged. I stood in the doorway and listened, not out of malice, but because I wanted to know what the penitent sounded like when the theater of secrecy gave way to a more honest script. Her voice broke at the end, and a wetness collected in my chest that had nothing to do with her. It was the weight of the world I had built alone in the dark. The long game tightened into a wire loop, evidence, witnesses, timing. She had tried to scrub the footprints. I had followed them. The chase had ended in knowledge. Now, with the pieces sorted and corroborated, I prepared the next move. Not a spectacle born of instant fury, but a revelation crafted for impact. The difference was intent. I would not let ruin be random. I would choreograph the truth to land with a force to unmake the lie she had been living. There is a peculiar clarity in the few hours before a reckoning. The world narrows to the fine grain of what must be done. I woke that morning with a taste of metal in my mouth, a cold coin of resolve that felt heavier than any grief. Outside, the street steamed from last night's rain. Inside, the apartment hummed with domestic ordinariness. The kettle clicked, a neighbor's radio muttered through thin walls. Ordinary life kept its cadence as if it could drown out the plan I had spent months composing. I liked the cruelty of that contrast. My fingers moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this motion until it had become muscle memory. I opened the private blog, scanned the files one last time. Screenshots, PDFs, Timestamps nested like Russian dolls, and felt a strange tenderness for the archive. Each image held the intimacy of our life's private seams, now arranged into a public cartography of betrayal. I attached everything to a single, concise email addressed to 3 groups: close family members, our immediate circle of friends, and a thin list of colleagues at her office. I debated the scope, how many people bore a moral right to know, and settled on an audience that would make the truth unavoidable without turning the world into an indiscriminate tabloid. The subject line was clinical, not cruel, confidential, evidence of infidelity. For your awareness, I refuse sensationalism. The email's body was short and factual: date, a brief explanation, a request of discretion, and then the attachments. I read the note twice, feeling each word like a test of my own restraint, then hit send. For a moment, nothing happened. The little progress bar crawled across the screen, and then disappeared. A soft, absurd finality. The deed was done. I could have walked away then, let the truth ripple without my hands on the edges, but I couldn't. Revenge, as I'd learned, is a piano you play with both ingenuity and cruelty. Some notes are loud, some are minor chords. I dialed Tom's number. His voice was calm when he answered, practice in the way of media men. "It's out," I told him. The line crackled with distance. "Good," he said simply. "Expect replies." He gave me a time, 90 minutes, official echoes, 3 hours. The social tide would have found its current. The waiting was a physical thing. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, clearing coffee mugs, folding a shirt I knew I'd never miss in the same way again, leaving small acts of normalcy in the face of a life I'd just unstitched. I thought of the ritual I'd once shared with her. Breakfast together, the 2 mugs warmed by the same hands, the paper folded between us like a third presence. The memory made my throat ache. It also steeled me. If the email broke us, it would do so on terms I had chosen. When the first reply came, it was Anna. Her message was terse and immediate. "I'm so sorry. I'm here. Call me." Her words landed like a small, clean stone in the chaos. Then a cascade, icons popping up on my screen. Replies, questions, stunned silence converted into typed sentences. A cousin asked for clarification. A close friend sent a single line, "Are you okay?" The office listserv forwarded the email up the chain. A name I recognized from HR replied with procedural calm, "We will look into this." The social fabric shifted invisibly. People took sides like tectonic plates. Then my phone vibrated with a DM from Mark. I read his message with a curiosity that felt like a vice. "What the hell is this? Is she okay?" There was a rawness to it that suggested surprise. There was also an arrogance in assuming his innocence. I could have replied with vitriol, could have called him what he was. Instead, I forwarded one of the receipts, an expense showing 2 names and a hotel address, and watched the read receipt ping. He didn't respond again. The silence was a sound, the collapse of an alibi. She came home late that afternoon, the sky already bruised with evening. I met her in the hallway, hands folded, my face a mask of composed weariness. Her eyes went wide when she saw the look on my face, the look I practice in motel rooms of the mind. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would undo what had been sent into the world. Her phone buzzed furiously in her pocket. I could see her thumb hover over it like a moth over a flame. I did not reach for it. I wanted her to see the storm without my guidance. Inside, the apartment felt suddenly small, like the stage of a play where every prop had been turned against the actors. The television murmured an indifferent sitcom. The kettle's whistle seemed indecent. She stood by the window, hands wrapped around themselves as if to hold in the collapsing parts. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. It was a question that had physics, clarity, and force. I answered with a truth that had been distilled by months of calculation. "Because you chose secrecy. Because I could either live with it or make it real and measured." She sagged into a chair like a moth after a light has gone out, and for the first time I saw not arrogance or blame but pure, ragged fear. The fear of being seen, of being stripped of the carefully curated narrative she'd spun for herself. That fear was a currency, and I had banked the deed that cashed it. I watched her go through the stages. Denial, bargaining, shame, the sliver of pleading I had once melted for. The pleading, "Please don't," was meaner now because I knew the truth. I had framed it for other people to witness. The fallout was messy and immediate. Her sister called, voice sharp and incredulous. A couple of colleagues sent texts that were clinical, careful. At a gallery opening later that evening, the very place where Mark often circulated like a minor celebrity, rumors arrived like weather. A friend texted, heard about a thing. Are you okay? I texted back, terse, I'm fine. It was both true and false. I felt hollow and unmoored, and under that, a curious relief like the widening of a wound that had finally let out its infection. But the reveal did not land like the clean, cathartic wreck I had imagined. There were complicating voices, people who said she had been lonely, people who wondered if I had overreached, people who asked if public exposure was the only avenue. I listened to the chorus with an odd sense of detachment. Some responses were supportive. Others were damp with a moral recoil of a society allergic to spectacle. I had expected allies. I had not expected ambivalence to gnaw at me like a second betrayal. That night I lay in bed and listened to the plumbing settle, the city breathing in small, indifferent rhythms. Her side of the mattress was cold. I could tell she had not slept. The hollow of her cheek showed in the dim light. I felt no immediate triumph. The reveal had been executed, precise and surgical, but the aftermath was a cluttered wreck. People accessed their moral compasses and pointed them in directions neither of us had foreseen. I had set a trap, yes, and it had closed, but in closing it had caught more than I'd intended. Gossip, legal eyes, family loyalties fraying at the seams. As sleep finally dragged me under, the last thought that bent my chest was not about victory but about consequence. I had aimed to make truth unavoidable, to reclaim agency by making betrayal public. I had not considered how the ripple would reach beyond us, to Mark's career, to a family, to friendships built on a different foundation. In the cool dark, I realized the reveal was not an end but a pivot. The next moves would determine whether I had restored myself or simply traded one ruin for another. Outside, somewhere in the city, lives rearranged themselves around the evidence I'd sent like pebbles into a lake. The ripples were only beginning. The morning after the reveal was quieter than I expected, yet heavier in its weight. The apartment felt like a room after a storm, walls intact, windows unbroken, but the air dense with debris you couldn't see. I moved slowly, each action deliberate, brushing crumbs from the counter, checking that the tea kettle worked, making coffee in the ritualistic silence that had once been comforting. Now, silence carried the gravity of observation, every action measured, catalogued, intentional. She did not appear until late morning. Her steps were tentative, hesitant, the very opposite of the confident rhythm she had carried before. I could see the tremor in her hands as she reached for a mug. She avoided my eyes. I saw the messages, she said softly. Her voice had been drained of performance. There was no pretense, no practice apology. The rawness was almost unbearable. For a moment I thought perhaps this was the instant where our history would unravel entirely. I know, I said simply. My tone carried none of the triumphant satisfaction that I had expected. The satisfaction had always been quieter, more exacting. It was not about her shame. It was about clarity, about the reclamation of agency over my life. She sank into a chair, hands wrapped around the mug like a talisman. I could see her calculating, re-evaluating, questioning how she had misjudged the elasticity of trust. The ripples outside our apartment were already hitting. Texts, calls, emails, they trickled in with measured curiosity, concern, and judgment. Some were supportive. Friends who had known me long enough to believe in my narrative, others offering quiet sympathy. Some carried moral questioning. Was public exposure necessary? Couldn't this have been handled privately? Each one was a reminder that actions, even justified ones, resonate unpredictably in the world. I catalogued them too, though with less urgency. Now the evidence had a life of its own. She tried explanations, fragments of truth mixed with reasoning, loneliness, emotional neglect, curiosity, disconnection. None of them satisfied me. Explanations were insufficient. Actions had already carved a path beyond words. I listened without interruption, cataloging not only what she said but the patterns of defensiveness, the micro-expressions, the tilt of her head when she anticipated my judgment. There was no triumph in observation, only a cold understanding that some things cannot be undone. Her attempts to reconcile were now stripped of theatricality. Flowers left without flourish, notes handwritten but succinct, promises made without embellishment. "I will make this right," she said once, voice brittle. I measured her sincerity not by words, but by the absence of manipulation. Every gesture I observed was now a data point, a calculus of intention. The old tenderness that once made me forgive impulsively now existed as raw, analytical awareness. Love had mutated into something quieter, sharper, and more precise. Over the next few days, her routine shifted under scrutiny. I noticed how carefully she navigated the apartment, how she checked her phone at precise intervals, how she hesitated when leaving the house. Each small action was a reflection of the new reality. She had been seen, caught in the architecture of her own duplicity. Mark's presence in her life was muted now, withdrawn by the social exposure that had been inevitable after my reveal. I did not gloat. The thrill of mastery had always been private, tempered by the moral weight of what I had done. There were moments when our eyes met, and I felt the old ache, the fractured tenderness that remained despite months of manipulation and planning. I remembered mornings when we had lain together, trivial arguments over breakfast, shared glances that had conveyed intimacy without words. Those memories hovered like ghosts over the practical reckoning of the present. I did not forgive, I did not absolve, but I understood that these fragments were part of the human complexity that had made betrayal so devastating and, ultimately, so necessary to confront with clarity. Outside, the social tide responded in unpredictable ways. Friends and colleagues filtered the information I had released through their own moral lenses. Some aligned with me, validating my choices. Others questioned the ethics of exposure. Rumors circulated, but they were no longer distortions. They were part of the unavoidable consequence of truth laid bare. I watched it unfold quietly, understanding that control is never absolute, and that even the most calculated action cannot dictate every outcome. By the end of the week, she had begun to internalize the gravity of the situation. Her conversations became more cautious, her explanations more stripped of artifice. Even as I observed, I felt the strange duality of power. I had orchestrated a reveal, yet now I was also a witness to the slow, private reckoning of someone I had once loved deeply. There was no joy in this power, only a sober recognition that justice, measured, deliberate, and precise, was its own reward. I sat alone one evening, the dossier finally tucked away in a safe place, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. Months of surveillance, careful documentation, and painstaking planning had led to this juncture. The betrayal had been exposed, consequences had unfolded, and my agency had been reclaimed. Yet the emotional residue remained. A mix of relief, exhaustion, lingering sadness, and a faint ache for the intimacy we had lost. In the quiet, I realized that revenge is rarely about spectacle. It is about agency, about reclaiming control over one's life after trust has been fractured. It is about the quiet satisfaction of aligning action with consequence and the recognition that human relationships are lattice of vulnerability, choice, and accountability. When she finally approached me, no dramatics, no pleading, only a tentative attempt to bridge the new chasm, I understood the final truth. The past could not be undone. The betrayal had reshaped us both, irreversibly. And yet, standing amidst the remnants of what had been, I felt a measure of clarity, a sober peace in knowing that I had acted deliberately, measuredly, and with intention. The calculus of exposure had been executed, and now life would move forward, altered, cautious, and irrevocably real. The storm, literal and metaphorical, had passed. What remained was the aftermath, a landscape of truth, fractured trust, and the quiet assertion that, even after betrayal, a person could reclaim agency, stand unbroken, and navigate the uncertain waters of consequence with eyes wide open. Weeks passed with a slow, unrelenting rhythm. The apartment, once alive with the echoes of shared mornings, felt like a carefully staged museum, familiar objects in precise places, silence thick and deliberate. She had retreated into herself, moving cautiously, speaking sparingly, her gestures measured against the invisible ledger I carried in my mind. Every word she spoke, every smile she offered, seemed filtered through the prism of accountability. I, too, had changed. The months of surveillance, documentation, and careful orchestration of exposure had left their mark. I was no longer the trusting partner who had once assumed loyalty. My heart now operated in the cold calculus of patterns and behaviors. Yet, Beneath that precision, a subtle ache remained, an echo of tenderness I could not fully extinguish, a reminder that even deliberate justice carries shadows of regret. She approached me one evening, the rain tapping faintly against the window pane as though reminding us of the storm we had survived. Her hair was damp, strands curling against her temples, and her eyes held something unfamiliar, unwilling resignation mixed with cautious hope. "I want to make amends," she said softly. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the years of unspoken guilt. I studied her for a long moment, weighing the authenticity of her words against the architecture of deceit she had once built. I wanted to believe, to return to the simplicity of early love, but the fracture was too deep. Instead, I responded with measured calm. "You had your chance to reconcile honestly. You've seen the consequences of your actions. If you truly want to change, it will be evident not in words, but in every decision you make from this moment forward." The days that followed were marked by a cautious, tentative truce. She focused on rebuilding her own life, severing ties with Mark, attending therapy, and communicating with friends and family to repair the network she had fractured. I observed, silently cataloging progress and slips, not as punishment but as a way to navigate the new equilibrium. It was a strange companionship, mutual proximity without intimacy, shared spaces without trust. Then, one evening, the final twist arrived, unexpected, subtle, and pacing. I discovered a note tucked beneath the folder I had once used to hold the dossier, handwritten, small, deliberate. It was from her, simple, almost childlike in its neatness. "I've learned that love is not ownership. You gave me the mirror, and I saw myself clearly. I cannot undo the past, but I can choose differently now. Thank you for showing me what honesty really costs. I hope one day we can speak without ghosts between us." The note hit me harder than any confrontation, any exposure, any meticulously planned act of revenge. For a moment, the precise control I had cultivated wavered. I realized that the ultimate reckoning was not in public exposure, not in calculated retaliation, but in the human capacity for reflection, acknowledgement, and transformation. She had accepted accountability, and in doing so, had returned something I had long thought irretrievably lost, a measure of understanding. I folded the note carefully and placed it in the safe where the dossier rested. The finality was not dramatic or explosive. It was quiet, understated, yet profoundly complete. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. Betrayal reveals character, revenge tests morality, and closure is found not in spectacle but in clarity of action and acceptance of consequence. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe fully, free of the constant vigilance that had consumed me. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and damp wood, the city beyond pulsing with ordinary life, and I sat in the quiet knowing that I had survived the betrayal intact, not unscarred, but unbroken. In the end, the greatest revenge had not been public humiliation, not even control over the narrative. It had been the reclamation of my own life, the assertion of my moral agency, and the recognition that truth, once revealed, is both a weapon and a salve. She had betrayed me, yes, but I had endured, observed, and finally released both the past and the tension it carried. And in that release, I discovered something unexpected: freedom. Freedom from deception, freedom from obsession, and freedom from the ghost of love corrupted by secrecy. The story had ended, not with spectacle or vengeance, but with a quiet, irrevocable reckoning that left both of us facing the future as changed, accountable, and inevitably human beings.